Okay, so tonight's topic, as you probably saw on the website, is pretty much all about the different forms of play. The first part of it will kind of go over our main forms of play with match play and stroke play. And then at the very end, if we have some time, we'll jump into some little bit weirder forms of play. That's covered by Rule 21, some Stableford stuff, maximum score, some other weird stuff that never comes up super often, but we will go ahead and get rolling here with just the majority of Rule 3, which covers how we play golf, the main forms of how we play golf. There's a bit of an outline of Rule 3, everything we're going to talk about tonight. Talk a little bit about what match play and stroke play is, a little bit of each form and what the differences are between each form of play. Here's what the rule covers. Talk about each of the forms, the things that are specific to match play itself that only are in that form of play, things that are only in stroke play. Purpose statement for Rule 3 talks about three central elements of all golf competitions, how we play them. So really with these three things on the screen here, we're either playing match play or stroke play. We're either playing as an individual or with a partner as part of the side, or we're either playing with gross scores using handicap or not using handicap strokes, or we're using net scores where we're factoring in handicap strokes. So really, there are two ways to play golf, either match play or stroke play, but really there's six buckets we can kind of drop our ball in. Match play or stroke play being the first two, by ourselves or the partner being the next two, and then either gross or net scores being the third two. So really six different buckets of how we play golf in a form of play. See the definition of match play, and most of us know the definition of match play. It's just where we're playing against either one other person, or if we're playing as a part of the side with a partner, we're playing against another side, and we're only playing that other side or that opponent's. And match play, it's just us versus them, one versus one, two versus two, however we're going to look at it. And we're going to we're going to win a hole by completing that hole in fewer strokes than who we're playing against. We're going to win the match when we either lead our opponent by there's more holes than remain to be played, or we run out of holes and all 18 holes are played and we're one up in the match. A couple of things that are highlighted here in the definition with player, opponent, and side. Player always being us when we're talking about the rules of golf, the player themselves. The side, again, if we're playing with a partner, me and the partner and myself, that is what accompanies the side. And then one other key highlighted term you see on the screen there with opponents. The term opponent only applies to match play. We're only talking about an opponent in match play. When we're talking about stroke play, and we'll see later in a few other slides with stroke play, we don't have multiple opponents in stroke play. We're just playing against an entire field. So in match play, when we're talking about opponents, that's the only form we're talking about is match play. We don't have a definition for player in the rules of golf, but it is a good thing to see what the term actually encompasses. We use it in both match play and stroke play. And really, again, it's referring to ourselves when we're talking about the rules of golf, but it just refers to any golfer except the opponent, a partner, or other members of the side. Opponent, again, we're only using this term in match play. It's just the person we're competing against in the match. Side, again, we're competing with a partner as a single unit, either in match play or stroke play. We can compete as a side in both forms of play. Whether we're playing our own ball and we're competing as a side playing our own ball, like we do in the form of four ball, or we're playing one ball as a side together and we're alternating those strokes playing as a side, as we do in the form foursomes. Key thing to note, a side is not the same thing as a team. There's multiple different team formats. College golf, high school golf, we see these as team formats where a bunch of individual players are playing all together as a team. A side is not the same thing as a team. A side is just me and a partner or two people playing as a side, playing either match play or stroke play. In a team competition, we could have a bunch of individual players competing as a team altogether, or a bunch of sides competing as a team altogether, but side is not the same as a team. Match play, we can either play as a singles match, we can either play it 1v1, just myself against someone else. We can play it as we saw against as a side, either in foursomes or four ball, where we have two partners competing together as a side. We can have a three ball match, which we'll talk a little bit more about three ball if we have some time at the end. But three ball match is a little bit of a weird form of play where it involves three players all playing a match against each other. A, B, and C. A is playing against B and C. B is playing against A and C, and C is playing against A and B. And they're all playing at the same time in the same round. So a little bit of a weird one. You don't see three ball very often, but we'll touch base on that if we have some time at the end. Flipping over away from match play to stroke play, which most of us are, when we think of the common form of how to play golf, we're thinking of stroke play, just the regular form of stroke play itself. It's just a form where either a player or a side, we're competing against all their players or all their sides playing together in that competition. If we have a field of 100 players and it's myself as a single playing against all 99 other players, or if we have a field of 50 sides, it's myself and my partner competing against all those 49 other sides in that field. In the regular form of stroke play, we're just counting up all the strokes we make throughout the round and the total number of strokes we have at the end. That's going to be our score or the side score, whatever we might be competing in. The winner is going to be whoever has the fewest number of strokes when we get all done tallying them up at the end of the round or the end of multiple rounds. Some other forms of stroke play, and again, we'll talk about these at the end if we have some time. We'll touch base on them, but some other forms of stroke play that differ than just adding up all the strokes for holes 1 through 18 and totaling them up. Stableford, max score, par bogey. They all kind of use their own unique scoring system. Stableford may be the most common that everyone's familiar with. Stableford using a points scoring system, but max score and par bogey are a little bit more unique, a little bit more not very common. So we'll talk about those at the end if we have some time. And just like with match play, all forms of stroke play can either be as an individual or competing as a part of a side with a partner. So we'll get into actually the heart of the rule itself and talk a little bit about those 6 buckets we talked about with match play or stroke play, playing as an individual or a partner, and with gross scores or net scores. Really, this is one of my favorite charts we have with Rule 3, just laying out really all the differences between match play and stroke play themselves. Even though they're both forms of golf, and we're both trying to calculate scores, and the ultimate goal is to get the ball in the hole on each hole in the fewest number of strokes possible. They very much have some very unique differences between the two. We already know with match play we're playing against an opponent or as a side against an opposing side. With stroke play we're playing against an entire field. With match play, the best way I like to think of match play, and it's kind of the way it lays it out here, is they're 18 one-hole contests. It's one hole at a time. And whatever happened on the previous hole doesn't really matter because it doesn't affect what's going on in the current hole. Even though you lost the last hole or won the last hole, it doesn't change the results of what could happen on the hole you're playing or future holes. So I do like to think of match play as being a 18 one-hole contest. Rather, with stroke play, it's just one 18-hole contest. All 18 holes are going to add up at the end. And what you did 2 holes ago very well could matter come time when it is time to tally up all the total at the end. So one 18-hole contest versus 18 one-hole contests. Scoring match play, we lose holes, we win holes. We're going to score by whether we're up or down in the match. Stroke play, again, we're totaling up all those scores at the end on the scorecard. Match play versus stroke play, very different general penalty. And, as some of you, as we may know, we have different penalties in the rules of golf. We could have a 1-stroke penalty. We could also have a general penalty. And the general penalty in match play is we just lose the hole. In stroke play, it's 2 strokes. So very different penalty there in both of those forms of play. In match play, we always have the right to know what the match score is because the only other person that really needs to know that match score is the person we're playing against. And the score is really irrelevant to anyone else except me and my opponent. And because I can always see how my opponent is playing and my opponent always sees how I'm playing, we always either know the match score or we have the right to know the match score. In stroke play, where there could be 80 other players on the golf course at one time, we don't necessarily have any guarantee to know where we stand in the field or what the score is compared to anyone else. So a stroke play, we have no guarantee as to our standing on the golf course at any time. In match play, we can concede a hole, we can concede strokes, we can concede the match itself. Those things are allowed, but in stroke play, we can't do that. We got to get that ball in the hole every single time, and we got to record a score for every hole. That's one of the key requirements of stroke play. We got to hole out. In match play, we can overlook the opponent's breach because it affects nobody else other than myself and the opponent. And if I overlook an opponent's breach of the rule, it hurts nobody except for myself. And that's the thing you got to accept with match play if you're going to do that. With stroke play, the rules are there to protect the field. I can't see what everyone else is doing at any time in stroke play, 4 holes away, 5 holes away. So the rules are going to be the ones who protect the field. In match play, I have to protect my own interests. And with match play, we can resolve doubts or request rulings before the next hole starts. And that's kind of what we have to do if we're unsure about something, or if we're really not sure that our opponent did something right, or if we just want to make sure that we get that to the committee to have them make a ruling on it. We have that time limit of doing it before the next hole starts. In stroke play, that time limit's a little further down the road. That time limit is before we return our scorecard. So even if we're unsure what to do, we have that right to play a second golf ball in stroke play, bring it up with the committee later before we turn our scorecard in. So the time limit on requesting a ruling or figuring out what the right procedure was, those time limits differ in each of those forms of play. So as we know in match play, we got a player and an opponent competing against each other based on how many holes are won, lost, or tied. Going to figure all that out as we progress through the match. In stroke plays, we know we're totaling up that score at the end and comparing it to all the other players in the competition. A couple of things that apply in both forms of play is most of the rules in the book, rules 1 through 25, most of them are going to apply to both match play and stroke play. Very few differences if you look at the book as a whole. But there's certain things that apply in only one form or another. We already saw one rule difference between match play and stroke play, with the general penalty being different in both forms of play, loss of hole versus 2 strokes. See a statement there that talks about combining 2 forms of play into one single round. When we have match play and stroke play being played simultaneously, what to do there when we have rules that only apply in one or the other. And then we have those other forms of play that are covered by stroke play, Stableford maximum score par bogey. They use that different scoring method. Again, rules 1 through 20 apply in those forms of play, but they're modified based on whether we're doing Stableford max score and par bogey. So as we know, golf is either played by individual players or by partners competing as a side. We have a few examples there. Just one example, I believe, from the Ryder Cup. When we're competing together as individuals, we still have all those rules that apply in both forms of play. But when we have a partner, as when we're competing a part of a side, we have Rule 22 that modifies it for foursomes. If we're playing together as a side, only playing one ball, alternating strokes. Or if we're playing our own ball, but we're playing together as a side and 4 ball, we have that rule modified by Rule 23. And 22 and 23 are going to tell us that, hey, these things apply in every other form of play, but when you're playing together as a partner, they differ this way. So again, remember rules 1 through 20, we're applying throughout every form of play. But when we throw a partner into the mix, there's going to be a few things that are different, and we have 2 rules that cover when those 2 things are different. For the times that we're competing as a team, not as a side, remember, but we're competing as a team, we have another rule that covers that as well with Rule 24. So if we're playing with either our own self or a partner, we have to know whether we're doing gross scores or net scores. And in scratch competitions, gross scores, where we're not factoring in a handicap, we're just adding up every stroke we take, including penalty strokes, and that's going to be our total number of strokes and our score for that given round. Not applying a handicap in scratch competitions when we're using gross scores. When we're using a handicap in handicap competitions, we're trying to find a net score for this one. We're still adding up all those strokes we took plus penalty strokes, but we're then adjusting the final score to account for players' handicap strokes. So we're doing this so we can have players of differing abilities that can fairly compete with one another. It's one of the best parts of our game that we have a system that allows players of differing abilities to compete against each other. There's not many other sports or games that allow for that. We'll get into some match play stuff specifically, talk about the result of a hole in a match, concessions, how do we apply handicaps in a handicap match, and the responsibilities of each of the player and the opponent. So, and real quick, after we get done with match play, we'll take a pause for some questions, move on to stroke play, and then jump into our final spot here. But we'll get through match play first, talk about the purpose of match play. We have some very specific rules for match play, mostly around concessions, giving information about the number of strokes taken. Because as we know, the player and the opponent are competing solely against one another. When I think about a match, there's this little individual bubble, and the only people in that bubble are the player and the opponent, or the two sides competing against each other. They can always see each other's play because they're never playing in different groups. They're always playing in the same group against each other. And like I mentioned before, we have to protect our own interest in match play since the only two people being affected in match play are you and the opponent or the two opposing sides. So we got to protect our own interests. We don't have a field to protect in match play. How do we win a hole in match play? Well, we simply just have to complete the hole in fewer strokes than our opponent does. Or the opponent either concedes the hole. There's a possibility that there's no possible way that that opponent's going to make up all those strokes that the other players already taken, so we can just concede the hole. It's possible the opponent or the player gets the general penalty, which we know in match play is loss of hole. So as soon as the player or the opponent does something that carries the penalty of the general penalty, the hole is over and the other person has won. Something a little weird with match play is when we have the ball in motion and we have the results of the hole that has already been decided or the hole needs to be tied. If that ball's in motion and the ball is deliberately deflected or stopped by any person, but it happens at a time where there's no reasonable chance that that ball is going to go in the hole. Way it's rolled past the hole, it's not going to roll to the hole, it's not going to roll back towards the hole. It never has a chance to get to that hole or get in the hole itself. The results of the hole has been decided and the player wins the hole. So this is commonly referred to as the Jordan Spieth exception in the rules worlds. There was a scenario with Jordan Spieth at the Ryder Cup, or it might have been the President's Cup, one of those competitions. Handful of years ago, opponent was putting. There was no possible way that ball was going to go in the hole. They were going to concede the hole. Jordan Spieth slapped the ball in motion, got the penalty, and lost the hole. This has been changed as of, I believe, the 2019 rule change. There's now an exception to when the ball is in motion, but it only applies when there's no possible chance that that ball is going to go in the hole. When that opponent is putting for a tie, it needs to be holed for that tie. It's no possible way that ball is going to go in the hole, and the other player either picks it up or deflects it back to the person. No penalty here. The result of the hole has been decided. When a hole is tied, we used to know this as halved before the rules changed in 2019 with some old terminology. We used to call this halving a hole, but we just call it tying a hole now. So when a hole is tied now, the opponent and the player have the same number of strokes. We both got in the hole for 4. We just move on. Hole's tied, and the status of the match has not changed. Or there's a possibility we can treat the hole as tied. Maybe we both hit a ball out of bounds. Neither of us like this hole. We don't play it well. We can just agree that that hole is tied. Let's move on to the next one. Can only do this though after at least one of the players has made a stroke to begin the hole. So if we both get up to a tee box, neither of us has made a stroke at the ball yet. We can't agree the hole is tied just yet. One of us has to make a stroke to start that hole before we can make that agreement just to tie the hole and move on to the next one. And of course, after we've played a bunch of holes and we're getting down to the end, we got to figure out how do we win the match. We're going to win the match when the player leads the opponent by more holes than remain to be played. So if we're 4 up and there's 3 holes left to be played, no possible way that opponent can catch up by winning the remaining amount of holes. So the match is going to be over. That's one way we're going to do it. The opponent can just concede the match at any time. If the opponent is feeling like they just have no chance or they don't want to keep playing or whatever the case might be, the opponent can just concede the match. Player wins it, the match is over. Or it's possible the opponent does something that disqualifies them. If they breach a rule that carries the penalty of disqualification, breach a code of conduct policy that might carry the penalty of disqualification. If they do something that disqualifies them, that's another way the opponent can win the match. The match is tied after we get to the end of the final hole, whether it's a 9 or an 18-hole match or less than that. Let's just say it's an 18-hole match. If we get to the end of 18 holes and we're tied, we're just going to extend that match 1 hole at a time until we have a winner. One of the things that's unique about that with match play is that when we're extending a match 1 hole at a time, it's part of the same round. We're not starting a new round. This is not another 18 holes. We're just continuing that match or continuing it 1 hole at a time as part of the same round. Typically, we're going to play the holes in the same order as we did in the rounds. That might be 1 through 18, 10 to 18, then 1 through 9, whatever that order might be, unless the committee sets a different order. And this is really common if we can't go back to 1, or if the easiest way is just to go back to 18, whatever that might be, if the committee says there's a different order, that's what we're going to do. It's possible that the terms of our competition may say that the match will end in a tie rather than be extended. This is common in the Ryder Cup in the early rounds. It's possible that we might just tie the match, end it after 18 holes, and split a point. The match just might be tied for some other reason, but it's possible that rather than extending it 1 hole at a time, we can just call the match a tie. When that match becomes final is up to the committee, whether that's when a score is posted on a scoreboard, whether players have reported to a committee, whether players have left a scoring area, whatever that might be. The committee is the one who determines how that match might be final. And a couple examples there of when a match may be final. Just as an example, for purposes of our CGA match play, senior match play, things like that, typically in our terms of the competition, we have the match being recorded as final when it's reported to the committee. So when someone in that match reports the results to the committee, and that committee records it in our scoring system, that match has become final. Everyone's favorite part of match play is concessions. How do we concede a hole, the match, stroke? What do we do? As we know in match play, we can do that. We can concede a stroke, hole, or the match. If we're conceding the next stroke, if we're conceding the next stroke, we would be conceding the hole as well, typically. We're going to be allowed to do that anytime before that opponent's next stroke is made. So before that club hits the golf ball, we can concede that next stroke and treat that stroke as being good. If that's the case, then we're going to treat that as the opponent has completed the hole with the score that includes that conceded stroke. And at that point, the ball can be removed by anyone. The player can pick it up, the opponent can pick it up, the hole's over. So if a player's putting for 3 and before they putt, we concede it and tell them that's good, we're going to treat that as they have completed the hole in 4 strokes because we're including that conceded stroke as part of their hole score. If we, for some reason, concede a stroke while the ball is in motion from that previous stroke, if we're doing it while the ball's in motion, we're applying that to the opponent's next stroke. So if a player putts that ball and they were putting for a 3 and they miss the hole, but the ball's still in motion and we say that's good, again, we're treating it as if they've completed the hole in 4 strokes. So an example here from the US Amateur, birdie to win. Putt was conceded while the ball was in motion. Andy Ogletree walks away with a 4. If for some reason that ball was in motion and we conceded the hole while the ball was in motion and the ball goes in the hole, then the concession doesn't matter. We're just going to treat it as if it was hold with that stroke, and that's what the score is going to be. So the player was putting for three. While the ball's rolling, we say that's good for the next stroke. The ball goes in the hole. Player holds out for a three. Something that doesn't seem like it should be right or it should be allowed against the rules, but we can concede the opponent's next stroke by just deflecting or stopping that opponent's ball in motion. And again, because the ball was in motion, we're treating this as we're conceding the next stroke after that. We can only do it if it was done specifically to concede the stroke and if there was no reasonable chance that stroke can be hold. If there was a chance that stroke can be hold, and if we didn't do it specifically to concede that next stroke, we're going to be treating it as if the ball was deliberately deflected by us, and then we're going to jump to Rule 11 to figure out what that penalty is. If we're conceding the hole, we can just do that anytime before the hole is completed. Doesn't really matter if we're doing it as we're walking off the tee box, we're walking up to the putting green, maybe we're chit-chatting in the fairway. If we're going to concede the hole itself, we're just going to do it before the hole is completed, including before even players start the hole. So we saw if we're treating the hole as tied, we have to do it as long as one of us starts the hole. If we get up to a tee box and I just know I'm not going to make anything better than 6 on this hole, and I've seen my opponent birdie this hole time and time again, and I just know I don't have a chance. Before either of us make a stroke, I can just concede the hole and we can walk to the next one. Neither of us have to make a stroke here if I'm conceding the hole. We're not allowed to agree to concede holes just to shorten the match, just because neither of us wanted to play 18 holes that day. Let's just say, hey, I have dinner reservations. Do you want to play a 16-hole match? We'll just concede these two back to back with each other. We're not allowed to do that. It's an agreement that's not allowed in match play. If we make this agreement and we do so knowing that it's not allowed, both of the partner and the opponent are going to be disqualified from the match. If we're just conceding the entire match as a whole, maybe we're done. We know we're not going to win this match, or the stroke's not there today, or whatever the case might be. We're just conceding the match. We can do it anytime before the result of the match is decided. Even before the players start the match, I can walk up to my opponent on the first tee, and I just know I'm not going to win today. Stroke was horrible on the driving range. Maybe I only have 2 balls in my bag. I just know it's not going to be a good day. I can just concede that match before we even get started. So, got to do it anytime before the result of the match is decided. A couple of different ways how concessions are made. Most of the time, we're going to do it verbally, or we're going to do it by an action that clearly shows the player's intent to concede the stroke the whole of the match. Making a gesture, maybe a thumbs up, maybe a pick it up, maybe a nod of the head, whatever that might be. Again, most of the time we're going to do it verbally. Either that's good, hey, the hole is yours, you win this one, whatever that might be. If for some reason our opponent lifts their golf ball and they do it because of a reasonable misunderstanding that they had a stroke or something that was being conceded, they thought they were getting a concession. Maybe they thought they heard that's good, but their opponent said, hey, good stroke, and they just had a misunderstanding. And they picked their ball up. There's not going to be any penalty. We're just going to replace the ball back on the original spot. If we don't know that, we're going to estimate it. We're just going to put that ball right back down where we picked it up from, no penalty, and continue the hole from there. One thing about concessions is they're final. They can't be declined or withdrawn. I can't choose to decline a concession. Maybe I say, hey, no, I'm going to complete the hole. Or if I concede it to my opponent, and then 2 seconds later I say, wait, maybe I don't want to do that. That concession's final. Once that concession has been given, hole's been decided, we're moving on. We're playing a match that uses handicaps, so we're playing a net match. Typically, before that match is started, the player and the opponent should tell each other what their handicaps are before that match gets going. You'll notice the word should is in here and not must. If the word was must instead of should, it would be a requirement. But it's not a requirement. It's just a recommendation that the opponent and players should tell each other what their handicaps are before the match gets going. If for some reason a player declares a wrong handicap either before or during the match, and they don't correct that mistake before the opponent makes their next stroke, we have two outcomes here. And the outcome depends on whether they told their opponent a handicap that was too high or a handicap that was too low. If they told their opponent a handicap that was too high, so where they're getting more strokes than they should have, they're going to be disqualified. No way out of that one. The only way out of it, actually, is if it doesn't affect the number of strokes the player gives or gets. If it doesn't affect the number of strokes that they give or get, there's no penalty. So going back to our first example here, if they're an 8 handicapper and they told their opponent they're a 9 when they should have declared an 8, and based on the formula of, with the course rating, the slope, and the course handicap, if that gives them 8 strokes where they should have gotten 7, they're going to be disqualified. But if they're a 5 handicapper and they declare a 6, and that same formula works out where they got 5 handicap strokes in either scenario, and it doesn't affect the number of strokes they were getting, there's no penalty. So if they're declaring a higher handicap that affects the strokes they're getting, and they don't correct that mistake before that opponent makes that next stroke, they're getting disqualified. If they're declaring a handicap that's too low, which I have no idea why you do this, you're just jibbing yourself out of strokes from a net match. There's no penalty, but you got to use that declared number of strokes that you gave your opponent. The holes where those handicap strokes are applied, they're given on particular holes. When we're playing those particular holes, if one of the opponents is getting a stroke or, maybe giving a stroke back, whatever that might be, the lower net score is going to win that hole. So in this case, Aaron and Zabriskie are playing a match. We go to hole number 8. Aaron wins with a 5. Zabriskie had a 4. If those were the gross scores, but Aaron was getting a stroke to where that turns that 5 into a 4, then Aaron would tie that hole 4-4. If a tied match is extended, we're going to apply those handicap strokes the same way they were given out in the regular match, hole by hole, unless the committee has a different way of doing so. Each player is responsible for knowing where those holes that they get the handicap strokes or give those handicap strokes back based on the allocation set by the committee. Usually it's found on a scorecard, but not always. But the player is responsible for knowing where they're going to get those strokes in the match. If the players fail to apply those strokes or mistakenly apply the handicap strokes and they agree to those results and they move on, that hole's going to stand unless we correct that mistake in time. And going back to here, depending on what that time is, we typically got to do it before the play of the next hole begins, if it's holes 1 through 17. Or if it's hole 18 or the last hole of the match, we got to do it before that result is final. We're going to try and speed through the rest of match play so we can ensure we get to stroke play here. But last part of it, we're going to talk about the responsibilities of the player and the opponent. We got to be truthful and tell our opponent about the number of strokes taken at any time, either during the play of the hole or after the hole is completed. The opponent might ask us during the play of a hole about the number of strokes either have taken currently or any penalty strokes the player has taken on a hole. We got to do this because the way an opponent plays, the way a player plays, that might factor into the strategy that one of those people might play in the match. They might decide how they play their next stroke, the rest of the hole, to confirm how the results of the hole was, whether they're trying to think about a concession. So telling the opponent about the correct number of strokes is a key part of match play there. If an opponent or a player is asked about the number of strokes taken, or when given that information without being asked, we got to give the right number of strokes. If a player fails to respond to that opponent's request or gives the wrong number of strokes taken, and we don't do that, and we don't correct that mistake before that next stroke is taken, we're going to get a general penalty, loss of hole. If we do correct that mistake before that next stroke is taken, then we're not going to get a penalty. If we have that mistake given with the wrong number of strokes while playing a hole, we got to do it before that next stroke is made on that hole by the opponents. If we give that wrong number of strokes after the hole is completed, we got to correct that mistake before the next hole is started. And just see that makes another stroke. And if it was after the hole is completed, to begin another hole. If we do it before on the final hole of the match, got to do it before the results of the match is final. One weird exception, we can still give the wrong number of strokes here, but there's no penalty if it has no effect on the understanding of the result of the hole. So if my opponent has a 7 on the hole and I told my player I had a 4 when I really had a 5, the result of the hole is the same. I still won the hole, and it doesn't have any effect on that player's thinking or that his understanding of whether that hole was won, lost, or tied. So no penalty in that weird scenario where you can still give a wrong number of strokes, but it doesn't affect whether their understanding of the hole was lost, won, or tied. Typically, when we get a penalty in match play, we got to tell our opponent about that penalty as soon as reasonably possible. Taking into account to where how close they are to us. If they're 5 feet away, we can just typically tell them because they're close enough to us. If they're way down the fairway, we're going to try and tell them as soon as possible as we get closer to them down the fairway. So requirement still applies even if the player does not know about the penalty. Players are expected to recognize when they have breached a rule, or if they're taking relief from something from a penalty area, unplayable lie, whatever it might be. Still got to tell our opponents about a penalty. There's some times where an opponent might see us taking relief from a penalty area, and there might be an understanding of, hey, they're taking relief. There's a penalty there. And sometimes where in that understanding where they're watching us take relief from that, it's not always, it's probably good to just tell your opponent, hey, that was a penalty stroke. I took relief from that penalty area, instead of just assuming that your opponent knows what you're doing. If we fail to tell an opponent about that penalty, we don't correct that mistake, just like before that opponent makes another stroke or possibly tees off on the next hole, we're going to get the general penalty, loss of hole. No penalty if we don't tell the opponent about it. If the opponent knew the player had that penalty. So again, seeing the player take obvious penalty relief. Again, good practice just to tell them anyways, but if it's obvious that we were taking penalty relief, there's no penalty if we don't tell the opponent about it. We're always expected to know the match score, our status in the match, whether we're up, down, tied, whatever that might be. Whether we lead the match is tied. We're always expected to know what that status of the match is. If for some reason we mistakenly agree on a wrong match score, the wrong status of the match, we can either correct that before either player makes a stroke to begin another hole, or for the final hole before the results of the match is final. But if we don't correct that mistake and we continue on with the match, that wrong match score then becomes the actual match score. And we're going to proceed with it being the match score, and that's the status of the match going forward. The exception to this is when a player requests a ruling in time. If we make a timely request for a ruling and it's found out that the opponent either gave the wrong number of strokes taken or failed to tell another player about the penalty, we're going to correct the wrong match score. We're going to revert back to what it should have been. And as we've seen before, we're going to protect our own rights and interests in match play. If we believe that the opponent has breached a rule or has a penalty attached to it, we can either choose to act on that breach or choose to ignore it. If we make an agreement, though, to not apply the rules the way they're written, or to waive a penalty they know applies, or to apply a penalty differently, and either of the players has begun the round with this agreement in place, both players are going to be disqualified in this case. Sometimes we'll have a referee assigned to a match or multiple matches. If we do have a referee assigned to a match, that referee is responsible for acting on any breach of the rules that they might see or are told about. So even though you might have been planning on overlooking something, if there's a referee assigned to that match and they see it, they're going to act on it, and you're not going to have the opportunity to overlook it. Before we get into stroke play, any quick questions on match play? I know I was going kind of fast there. We'll have some time at the end to address any questions, but if you do have a quick question on match play, feel free to unmute yourself or drop it in the chat, and we'll try and address it here before we move on. We'll just give a quick 30 seconds here for any questions on match play. Okay, we'll roll on with stroke play and finish out the rest of stroke play here in the next 15 minutes or so, and then hopefully we'll leave a few minutes at the end just to touch quickly with either questions or touch quickly on Stableford or any other forms of play tonight. But mostly a stroke play very much differs from match play in that we know we're going to add up all of our strokes, compare them to the field, and all of that. Just like with match play, stroke play has some specific rules, particularly for scorecards and holing out, because one, we need to hole out because we need to know our score on every hole, and we need to turn in a scorecard at the end of the round. After the round, we have a player and a marker. The marker is the person who keeps that player's score on the scorecard. We have to certify the player's score. We have to sign our scorecard. We have to make sure each hole is correct, that we're going to return that scorecard to the committee. The winner in stroke play is the player who completes all rounds or the only round in the fewest number of strokes. And that's going to be the winner. If it's a handicap competition, that means the fewest total net strokes. So the number of strokes they took minus their handicap, and that's going to get us our net score. Sometimes the terms of the competition might tell us how a tie should be decided, whether it's a sudden death, an aggregate playoff, a scorecard playoff, whatever that might be. Our terms of the competition are going to tell us how we're going to break that tie. So scoring and stroke play, we have a scorecard and a marker. Scores are kept on that scorecard by the marker. Example of a scorecard here. We have 18 boxes for 18 scores. I'll write all of our scores in there. That's going to give us our score at the end. Scorecard can be in any form, paper, electronic, whatever we might have that's approved by the committee. If anyone's played any CGA events over the last 5 or so years, you know that we've gone to electronic scorecards for our CGA events. As long as that form of scorecard allows scores to be entered for each hole and allows for a marker and a player to certify those scores either by a physical signature or some method of electronic certification. We don't have a scorecard in match play, or I should say we don't have a scorecard that's required in match play. Sometimes we have one just to have a little bit of an easier time to keep track of the match status with each of the players or the referee, but scorecard is not a requirement in match play. We don't have a scorecard that's turned into the committee for match play. So this is only a stroke play requirement. See the definition of a marker there, person responsible for entering the player's score on the scorecard and also certifying that scorecard. Can be another player, can be any other player in stroke play on the golf in their group, but it can never be a partner. So someone else who I'm competing with as part of a side cannot be my marker. Committee's typically going to tell you who the marker is for you, or they're going to let the players choose a marker. You see this? We know the scorecard. Scores are kept on the scorecard by the marker. Typically, we're going to have the same marker for the entire round, but in extenuating circumstances where that marker withdraws, is disqualified, whatever that might be, come back, play suspended, come back the next day, you don't have your marker. It's possible the committee might approve that change either before or after it happens, but typically we're going to have the same marker for the entire round. Go over a few things here with scoring and stroke play. Couple things that are the marker's responsibility themselves. The marker has two main responsibilities. They have the individual hole scores on the scorecard, and then they have their signature at the end of the round. And those two things are the marker's responsibility. They got to make sure that they get those things right when it comes time to turning in that scorecard. When the round is ended, the marker is typically going to sign that scorecard. They're going to certify it that it is correct before handing it back to the committee. If the player had more than one marker during the round, each marker has got to certify the scores. unless one of the markers saw the player play all of those holes. Maybe it was a third player in the group. And if that was the case, then that marker may certify all of the holes together, just as one certification. Possible that a marker may refuse to certify a player's hole score if this marker believes it's wrong or there's some cheating going on or whatever the case might be, but a marker might refuse to certify that scorecard. In such a case, the committee will need to consider some evidence, whether there's a disqualification coming to that player, whether another marker can certify it, but the committee is going to then make the decision for that scorecard if that's the case. If that marker still refuses to certify the player's score, the committee can then certify that score or can accept certification from someone else who saw the player's actions or whatever the case might be. But typically, if the original marker is not certifying that scorecard, it's typically going to go into the committee's hands after that. If we're certifying a score that we know is wrong, or we certify a whole score that we know is wrong, typically we're going to disqualify that marker. Again, we see that word should, markers should be disqualified. It's not a must, it's not an automatic disqualification, but the committee should disqualify them and would be justified in disqualifying the marker if they knowingly certify a wrong scorecard. Just like the marker, the players got a couple of responsibilities themselves on the scorecard. They have all those 18 hole scores to make sure that they're correct and added up. They have to make sure the marker certifies their scores, and they got to make sure that they themselves certify them scores. For returning that scorecard, they should carefully check those holes. If they have any issues with that, they should raise it with their marker or the committee. And they must not change a whole score entered by the marker. If they have to change something or if they think something's wrong, they got to bring it up with their marker and they got to change it together. If we're going to make a whole score, we don't typically, we used to see this all the time before the rules changed, but we used to see an extra certification on that specific whole score. We don't need that anymore. We just need the two signatures or the two certifications from the marker and the player. If we're changing a whole score, we don't need any extra certification anymore. If a player breaches any of those requirements that they have, whether it was the whole scores, the two marker signatures, they left something off that scorecard, didn't sign it, the marker didn't sign it, there's a whole score missing. If any of those requirements are breached by the player is going to be disqualified. One exception to this is when the marker fails to carry out their responsibilities, but the player has no control over that. If the marker failed to carry out their responsibilities and if it was beyond the player's control, maybe the marker left with the player's scorecard, the marker left without certifying it, the marker lost the scorecard, whatever that might be, there's no penalty to the player. We're just going to figure out a way to make that scorecard valid. And again, we have some committee procedures, recommendations on when that scorecard has been returned. Happens a few different ways. If you've played a CGA event, if you've ever looked at our hard card, you know that the scorecard has been considered returned once the player has left the defined scoring area. So once that player has left that defined scoring area, that scorecard has been returned and is final. Another model local rule that was introduced fairly recently reduces the penalty for returning a scorecard without the whole scores being certified. So typically without this model local rules, we saw if there's a scorecard that gets returned without a signature on it or with neither signature on it, that's going to be a disqualification of the player. But with this model local rule in place, we're going to reduce that penalty from disqualification to the general penalty applied to the last hole of the round. So if a player turns a scorecard in and they forgot to sign it, we're just going to apply a two-stroke penalty to their final hole of the round, and that scorecard is going to be considered returned. So avoids the disqualification with that model local rule. If we return our scorecard with a wrong hole score, we're going to have two outcomes here, and a lot of us are familiar with this, what those two outcomes are. If we return a scorecard with a higher score than our actual score, we're going to just get stuck with that higher score. We got to just live with it. No penalty, but we're going to be stuck with the higher score. So short video there. I don't know if you can hear the audio, but Example from the Masters, however many years ago, Roberto Di Vincenzo signed for a higher score in the Masters, lost the Masters because he signed for a higher score. For returning out a scorecard with a lower than actual score, so maybe we made a 4 on the hole and we're signing for a 3, we're going to be disqualified. If that's the case, we're signing for a lower score, not going to be a way out of it. We're going to be disqualified. And again, same video concepts. Got another exception here. We have a failure to include an unknown penalty. If we sign for a score that we forgot to include a penalty because we didn't know about it, then we're not going to get disqualified. What we're going to do is we're just going to go back and we're going to add in that penalty that should have been included. So if we got a general penalty, a two-stroke penalty that we didn't know about, or we were unaware that we got a general penalty, we signed for that score, we're not going to get a penalty. We're not going to get disqualified. We're just going to add in those penalty strokes that should have been included for that unknown penalty. The only time this exception doesn't apply is when the penalty is disqualification. If that unknown penalty is disqualification, the player is still going to be disqualified. If the player is told that a penalty might apply or was uncertain that the penalty applied and did not raise this with the committee before returning the scorecard, we're still going to disqualify that player for signing for that lower score. A couple things the player is not responsible for on their scorecard. They're not responsible for their name, the date, totaling up each 9 or the total number of scores, and they're not also responsible for their handicap on their scorecard. These are all things that the committee is responsible for. No requirement for the player's handicap to be shown on a scorecard or for the player to add up their own scores. These are things the committee is going to be taken care of. If we're going to return a scorecard that has a mistake on it and showing or applying the handicap or adding up those scores, no penalty because, again, this is a committee responsibility. Once the committee receives a scorecard, the committee is going to be responsible for adding up those scores, calculating any handicap strokes if it's a net competition, and then calculating that player's net score. So nothing that the player is responsible for here with totaling up or anything handicap wise on the scorecard. We can put a model local rule in that gives that handicap responsibility back to the player, but haven't seen this used much in club competitions or net competitions, but there is a possibility that that local rule gives that handicap responsibility back to the player. One of my favorites, failure to hole out with stroke play. It is one of my what I call my group of 5 rules, the 5 rules that require a correction in stroke play to avoid disqualification. 3.3c is one of those group of 5 rules that we got to correct or we're going to get disqualified. Quick definition of hold or hole out when the ball is holed. Special case there when the ball is resting against the flag stick, we leave the flag in the hole. Time of stroke play, as we know, we got to hole ball out. We got to get that ball in the hole so we know what's right on the scorecard each hole during the round. If for some reason we fail to hole out at any hole, we got to correct that mistake before making a stroke to begin another hole, or for the final hole of the round before returning the scorecard. If we don't make that correction of that mistake in time, we are going to be disqualified. Some of our other forms of play with Stableford, max score, par bogey, sometimes those ones we can always get away with not holding out because they use a different form of scoring. Where if we're not going to hole out or we're not going to get disqualified, we just might not get any points. We might get the max score. We might lose a hole, whatever that might be in those other forms of play. So I did see a couple messages in our chat real quick. Try to address these before we open it up to all of our questions. But question from Bill, what about the Sergio Kuchar deal? I don't know if Bill, if you're still on the call, if you want to unmute yourself, I'm not sure which one you're referring to there. I don't recall the scenario, but if you want to unmute yourself and clarify that, happy to answer that or clarify. or we can always come back. Another question from Tim Connell in Match Play. If a hole is conceded in the fairway before reaching the green, can the player that won the hole continue to play with no penalty, or must the winner stop playing and proceed to the next hole? Yeah, if you have a hole conceded and any further strokes in playing out that hole normally, in the normal progression of playing that hole is going to be considered fine. It's not going to be considered practicing in between the play of two holes. Now, obviously, you can't drop a bunch of balls and play out the hole from there, but playing out the hole is um, as you normally would in a normal progression would be fine. There, unless there's a model local rule in place, so it would prohibit that, but typically that would be fine. So Bill clarifies Sergio tapped in before Kuchar could say good. In that case, then the stroke counts. If you're going to make a concession, you got to make it before that next stroke is made. In typically, if the concession is made before the stroke, that's kind of the what I call crossing the Rubicon. There's a bunch of Rubicons in the rules of golf to where you got to do it before you cross that Rubicon. The stroke being made is that Rubicon. If you're going to make a concession, you got to do it before that stroke is made. And if the stroke is made, then that window to make the concession is gone. Any other questions I can address with match play and stroke play before we hop off? Again, feel free to unmute yourself or drop it in the chat. If not, we'll go ahead and close out the night here in the next couple minutes. I always appreciate everyone for hanging with us tonight. Appreciate you learning more about the rules of golf. We'll pick up in the next couple weeks. I think one of our next topics is either free relief or penalty relief. But we'll pick up in the next couple Tuesdays. And I'll hang on here just to address any last minute questions. But other than that, everyone have a great night. And I think it's dinner time for most of us.